Amidst the cries and groans of the mass of men, Titus Labienus struggles to hold back the ferocious assault. After 6 years of war, all of Gaul seemed ranged against them. Here at Alesia, there would be victory or death. Yet as thoughts of the latter loomed larger in his thoughts, a great cheer erupted. The scarlet cloak of one man seemed to breathe new vigor into the hearts and sword arms of the men. The eyes of the nearest barbarians widen as the men chant the name of Gaius Julius Caesar. Before we dive in, a quick word about our sponsor, NordVPN. I use NordVPN all the time, whether I'm at home or traveling. A lot of content is locked to a certain region, so to access it I have to pretend I'm somewhere else. With NordVPN, I can switch my virtual location and watch whatever I want. It also keeps my internet connection private and secure, blocking trackers, ads, and other online threats. And now with Threat Protection Pro, NordVPN even helps you detect fake web shops designed to scam you. And if you're wondering about speed, well, NordVPN is the fastest VPN service on the market, meaning that you don't have to deal with slow speeds or buffering. You can even protect up to 10 different devices on one account. Go to nordvpn.com/historymarshvpn for a very exclusive deal. You get 30-day money-back guaranteed, so there's no risk in trying it. Browse safe with NordVPN. Now let's get back to the video. 54 BC was a bad year for Gaius Julius Caesar. Though he certainly wowed folks back in Rome with his second campaign into far-flung Britain, he failed to bring the land and peoples there firmly under Rome's dominion. Furthermore, his absence had emboldened the peoples in the newly conquered Gaul to action. Unlike Britain, Caesar had arguably conquered the historically troublesome tribes of Gaul, to the extent that he risked his campaigns into Britain to begin with. However, on his return, a fresh rebellion erupted under Ambiorix. Having successfully lured a legion out of their camp, Caesar's prestige had been dented through the loss of Legia 14 and a further 5 cohorts of green troops under the leadership of Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta and Quintus Titurius Sabinus. To the Gauls, this demonstrated that Caesar was not invulnerable, and though Ambiorix and another attack were ultimately squashed, these events would merely foreshadow a far deadlier crisis to come. Caesar, meanwhile, had stamped out the fires of rebellion for now, yet his quartering of legions in isolated pockets had proved most unwise, and the Gauls were far from content under his brutal occupation. To hammer home his own commitment to Gaul's subjugation, Caesar had more than replaced the lost 14th, raising 2 more legions in Cisalpine Gaul, while Pompey lent him Legia I, so that throughout his pacification efforts in 53 BC, Caesar's army had swelled to 10 legions. Still, despite this, Caesar's brutal scouring of resisting tribes had only darkened the resolve of others. His recent public flogging and execution of the Senonian noble Acco sounded alarm bells in other chiefs that such a grim fate could befall any of them, should they displease their new Roman masters. Throughout the winter, secret gatherings took place in secluded woods, the better to scheme how those willing chiefs could throw off the Roman yoke once and for all. Among those present was a young Avernian noble by the name of Vercingetorix. Of course, the name comes down to us today as one of a brief unifier, yet ironically at the time the young Gallic noble may have begun as anything but. Caesar writes that his father Cheltullus had attempted to make himself king, something many of the more politically progressive tribes violently rejected, preferring instead to elect magistrates to power. Caesar writes that the son too nursed lofty ambitions of kingship. That Vercingetorix had little to gain from submitting to the status quo is therefore understandable, and when we factor into this his undoubted charisma and intelligence, it's no wonder tribally diverse bands of equally eager men flocked to his banner. Having sworn oaths of mutual support at these meetings, the conspirators were generally agreed that the time to strike would be soon. Vercingetorix and the other Gallic leaders knew that Caesar customarily took his leave of absence around this time, and that his legates and legions would therefore act passively and, with any luck, as ineptly as the ill-fated 14th had against Ambiorix. Caesar's enemies also hoped that his attention would be firmly fixed too on the deteriorating situation in Rome itself. With the gangs of Claudius and Milo at each other's throats, and the former killed in a fight just outside Rome, violence had once again erupted, and the consular elections were postponed. Yet though Caesar indeed watched events in Rome with concern, Vercingetorix and his allies were mistaken if they believed he would not intervene. The first blow was not struck by the Averni, however, but by the Carnutes. Late in the year, Cenabum was assaulted, and its garrison and Roman inhabitants annihilated. In a single stroke, Caesar's army had lost its major grain store under the protection of equestrian Gaius Fufius Caesar. The time for secrecy was decidedly over, as news of this disaster made it as far as 160 miles away by midnight. Vercingetorix too wasted no time piling in, rousing groups of eager young warriors into his cause. Initially, perhaps with the example of his father in mind, he was expelled from Gergovia by his detractors. Yet moving through the countryside, he quickly gathered a large following before expelling those who had ousted him. He was proclaimed king, and his representatives rode through Gaul so that he quickly enjoyed the support of many tribes. Now at the head of a tribal coalition, Vercingetorix demonstrated that he was no hot-headed war chief, but an intelligent strategist, also rivaling Caesar's own ruthlessness. He attempted to enforce an unaccustomed discipline on his army, whilst also planning for its supply. Any detractors could find themselves mutilated or even dead. Vercingetorix moved north into the territory of the Beta Reges, who were protected by Rome's old ally, the Aedui tribe. The Aedui naturally appealed to Caesar's legates for aid, however the latter simply threw the problem back to them, suggesting the Aedui send in their own force. However, it was symptomatic of this time of conflict and treachery that the Aedui never engaged the rebel army, instead turning back and claiming they suspected the Beta Reges were planning to act against them once they crossed the Loire. Whatever the truth of the matter, with the Aedui's withdrawal, the Beta Reges defected to Vercingetorix. Perhaps this was the event that showed Caesar's officers that things had truly escalated, as reports were now sent south and made for grim reading. Caesar by this time could count on Rome's stability, given Pompey's installation as sole consul and his stationing of soldiers in the city. Racing into Transalpine Gaul, Caesar had to think fast as the momentum was with the rebels, while he was dangerously separated from his legions. Even some border tribes had defected to the rebels, and now, turned by Lucterius, moved to strike the Colonia of Narbo itself, at the very heart of Rome's province. Caesar, however, proved Vercingetorix's equal in energy, and rushed to Narbo with some men recruited from Cisalpine Gaul, whilst also taking command of local cohorts and utilizing some tribal cavalry from the area. He ensured the defense of Narbo, and then massed his makeshift force in the lands of the Elvii, before leading it over the pass of the Cevenna. This move must have astonished the Averni. Now the man they least expected or wanted to see was in their territory with his own army, such as it was. Little did they know this was no veteran force. However, the bluff succeeded. Caesar's cavalry spread fire and death throughout Averni lands, which provoked frantic pleas to Vercingetorix to aid his own people. Vercingetorix obliged, but Caesar was already a step ahead, and, leaving his scratch force under Decimus Brutus, he headed for Vienna, from where he and an escort rode north without stopping. Reaching 2 of his wintering legions in the territory of the Lingones, he ordered the rest to converge at Agedincum. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix, realizing Caesar's bluff, turned back northwards, the Boii tribe firmly in his sights. Caesar sent messengers, reassuring their relief. This too was somewhat of a bluff, as the legions could not really sustain a long campaign. Caesar's food stocks were low, it was still winter, and he was unusually weak in cavalry, given he had had no chance to raise the usual levies. Inaction, however, was only likely to encourage the rebellion, and to forsake the Boii would make others question their own loyalties. Caesar marched on the birthplace of the revolt, Cenabum, via Velanadunum, and in a night assault took the place. With the gutting of Cenabum, Caesar earned Vercingetorix's undivided attention. Moving from Gorgobina, the Gallic king arrived just as his allies in Noviodunum were surrendering the place. Beating the Gauls back, Caesar persuaded the reluctant folk to surrender a second time, before focusing his attention on Avaricum, an important and particularly defensible town of the Beta Reges. Caesar settled in for a difficult siege, while the Averni king cautiously positioned himself a little off from the legions. Vercingetorix, already wary of directly engaging Roman legions in the field, was persuaded by his recent clash that a new approach was needed. In another meeting with his lieutenants, he had persuaded them to adopt a Fabian strategy to weaken the already underfed invaders through shadowing and denying its foragers supplies. This, of course, would require ruthlessness not only towards the Romans, but also themselves. All farms, supplies, and even towns that could aid Caesar would need to be destroyed. Though they had obeyed, the Beta Reges begged that their strong settlement of Avaricum be spared, and Vercingetorix reluctantly agreed. Yet despite constant rain, sorties, and a generally miserable time trying to fend off Vercingetorix's cavalry, Caesar's legions could not be starved or budged from their objective. In the meantime, the sting was potent to Caesar's suffering legionaries. Having built a ramp towards the only approach, Avaricum fell when on the 27th day, and in the driving rain, Caesar's troops stormed the place. Moved to a particularly hot wrath by their sufferings, and with Cenabum still fresh in their minds, only 800 of the 40,000 inhabitants survived the day. With substantial supplies secured and with the onset of spring, the situation was decidedly brighter for the legions. Resting at Avaricum for a few days, Vercingetorix's new strategy and his apparent timidity could not have escaped Caesar's notice, and so he decided his next conquest would have to be Gergovia itself, the home settlement of his rival. Tracing the Allia River, Vercingetorix initially prevented any crossing. However, through some expert misdirection, Caesar was able to effect his crossing. Potentially getting embroiled in an open battle was not in Vercingetorix's game plan, so he made his way to Gergovia, with Caesar hot on his heels. 5 days later, Caesar was grimly observing the town. As with Avaricum, Gergovia would be difficult to assault. Without sufficient supplies themselves, the legions also had little chance of starving out the occupants, though they hoped the Aedui would assist them in this regard. Never one to balk at a challenge, however, Caesar chose to cut off Gergovia's water supply, and in a night assault ejected a minor enemy garrison from the high ground at the foot of the wider plateau, the latter on which Vercingetorix had routed his army. Having secured this key site, Caesar ensured he would not mirror his rival's mistake by encamping 2 of his legions there. He completed his own partial blockade of the river by having his men dig 2 parallel ditches, connecting his camps under the wary eyes of the Gauls on the hills. Events elsewhere, however, would now temporarily shift the balance of power firmly into Vercingetorix's favor. Rome's oldest allies in the region, the Aedui, were wavering in their loyalty, and since they were also the bearers of Caesar's supplies, he felt it necessary to personally intervene. Unfortunately, while Caesar took 4 of his legions to forcefully persuade the Aedui of the errors of their ways, the remaining 2 legions had come under heavy and constant attack. Though the legate Gaius Fabius managed to hold his own, Vercingetorix had showered the defenders with storms of arrows and other missiles, wounding a great many. Disaster was only averted through sheer grit and the deadly aid of the artillery. Having awed the Aedui escort into accompanying him back to Gergovia, Caesar's effective hostages ensured the wider alliance would remain intact, at least for a while. However, their attempted defection persuaded Caesar to consider how best to withdraw from Gergovia and unite all 10 of his legions. Whilst at the smaller camp, he noted the sparse defense of the hill hard by the town, and that Vercingetorix had been busy fortifying the surrounding high ground through fear of a Roman breakthrough there. Caesar decided to excite this paranoia by sending out feint attacks in the region, including a full legion. Meanwhile, Caesar massed his legions for an attack. Accompanying the 10th, he surged forward, with the weaker defense proving little trouble to his men. The legionaries easily traversed the 6-foot stone wall the Gauls had built, and the attack was so initially successful that a Gallic chief had had to flee half-naked from his tent. Despite his orders not to get carried away, some of the attackers had reached the walls of Gergovia itself. However, Caesar's intent was never to storm the town, and judging enough damage had been inflicted, and wary of the larger Gallic danger to his flank, he sounded the retreat. With the call either unheard or ignored, only the 10th withdrew, leaving Caesar's remaining troops static and vulnerable. Vercingetorix had not been idle, and upon receiving frantic messages from the town, he dropped everything and ordered his own surge into the Roman flank. With his cavalry in the lead, the shock was completed when the Aedui on the Roman right were mistaken for enemies too. Why this happened is unclear, given these shaky allies did have their right shoulders bared, the agreed sign of a friendly Gallic unit. However, whether simply down to miscommunication or the sheer heat of battle, the Aedui's arrival triggered a retreat. Falling back with losses, Caesar could only cover their retreat with the 10th and some cohorts cobbled together who had been guarding the camp. Though far from a knockout blow, this was certainly a reverse, Caesar losing around 700 men and 46 centurions, though actual losses were likely heavier. News spread fast, and following Caesar's release of their cavalry, the Aedui tribe fully went over to Vercingetorix, slaughtering the Roman garrison and traders of Noviodunum. Noviodunum had also housed a huge amount of Roman grain and the main baggage. The Gallic resistance was therefore back in the ascendant, and though the Aedui attempted to place their own man at the head of the unified opposition, Vercingetorix was secure. His Fabian strategy was also endorsed, while the Gallic leader also requested an increase in his own cavalry support to 15,000. The tribes close to Transalpine Gaul were also urged to increase the pressure there. Caesar, however, refused to allow the Gauls the initiative, and linking up with Labienus, he moved his full-strength army, supplemented now by Germanic cavalry, into the territory of the Sequani. The raids into Rome's province were beaten off by local forces, and unfortunately for Vercingetorix, though his plan to destroy Caesar's outnumbered cavalry was sound enough, his own men were just not up to the task. Caesar closely pursued them to the settlement of Alesia. Like Avaricum and Gergovia, Alesia was formidable. A hilltop town, Caesar took one look at the place and decided on starving his enemies into submission. As in previous sieges, though, this would not be easy. To muddy matters further, Vercingetorix had had a 6-foot wall and ditch constructed on the more accessible of the approaches. Yet unlike at Gergovia, Caesar commanded all his legions and set them to work realizing his vision. They began the arduous task of confining the Gauls through construction of the Contravallation, which would take around a month. Its likely smaller sorties frustrated efforts during this time, while a major attack of Vercingetorix's cavalry was beaten back when Caesar's own Germanic auxiliaries joined the fray and, supported by legionaries, pushed the enemy back to the gates of Alesia with much loss. Meanwhile, as the noose tightened, Vercingetorix sent out his cavalry to sound the alarm and bring relief. If Caesar enclosed him, then he too would be enclosed, or at least pinned in place, and perhaps more easily destroyed. Little did the Averni king realize that Caesar would make this a stark reality, becoming besieger and besieged. Having learned that the relief army was on the way, Caesar ordered a second defensive circumvallation to protect his own. The sheer scale of the project must have awed the caged Gauls in Alesia. The first contravallation stretched an impressive 11 miles, incorporating 23 forts and eventually 8 large camps when the second project was completed. Yet these were no simple defensive walls, but accompanied by elaborate supporting structures and nasty defensive measures. In the west, a 20-foot wide ditch was dug between the Otze and Otzerain to warn of impending attack from the flatter ground of the plain. Over 100 yards back from this stood the main defences, including a double ditch, the innermost flooded, and then the 12-foot-high rampart. Even if undefended, these obstacles would have been daunting. Yet, in addition to these troubles, the Gauls would have also had to deal with the sharpened stakes, both seen and unseen, the latter obscured in pits, not to mention spikes and caltrops. It was as if Caesar had heard the Averni king's boast of impregnability and raised the bar to unreachable heights. Vercingetorix's troubles, however, only deepened as the long days stretched into weeks. His massive army within the walls could not be sustained indefinitely, and in a grim show of his own ruthlessness and determination, all useless mouths were ejected from the settlement. The cynical among us may suspect that this was also a calculated effort to simultaneously drain Roman resources while preserving his own. Whatever the case, Caesar was his rival's equal in this regard, and refusing exit to these masses of sick, old, women and children, the no-man's land between the armies echoed with the cries and pleas of the dying. When the huge relief army finally arrived, the spirits inside Alesia must have soared. By Caesar's estimate, his 40,000 to 50,000 troops now faced a relief force of 250,000 Gallic infantry, as well as 8,000 cavalry. Yet even if Caesar exaggerated by doubling the number, he was still easily outnumbered by the relieving forces alone. The Gauls were certainly confident as their army came into view on the plain. With their cavalry out front and supported by archers, they dared Caesar's legions to respond. Vercingetorix simultaneously moved his own forces out and began filling in the enclosing trench to aid his would-be liberators. An intense cavalry battle ensued, Caesar's infantry manning the defences, while the larger Gallic force enjoyed the support of their archers. These initially gave the attackers the edge, driving some of Caesar's cavalry from the battle. However, despite the roars of encouragement from both Gallic armies, Caesar's Germanic auxiliaries once again proved their worth. The fighting stretched out from midday to around sunset, the breakthrough coming when the Germans massed and attacked at a single point. This finally shattered the resolve of the Gallic horse, leaving the archers to be cut to pieces. More cavalry assaulted from other points and drove the remnants of the enemy back to their camp. With this failure complete, Vercingetorix and his men slinked back to Alesia. The next day saw no further attacks from the outside. However, this was merely the calm before a new storm. The reliever spent his time preparing ladders, ropes, and fascines to effect a break-in. At midnight, a momentous roar rent the air, while a little later the ear-splitting answer of Vercingetorix's trumpets answered. A fierce, if confused, night battle commenced. Caesar had entrusted this zone to his new quaestor, Mark Antony, and Gaius Trebonius, both of whom acquitted themselves brilliantly. Many a Gaul was shot at a distance with arrow, stone, or via Roman artillery. Of those many who did draw nearer, the traps and perils of the approach took many more, while at no point did they breach the Roman defences. Though hard-pressed at points, Antony and Trebonius brought in reinforcements from forts further away, ultimately driving back the assaults. It seems the efforts of Vercingetorix in particular were hampered by a lack of preparation and delays in filling in sections of the ditch. As for the outside attackers, as daylight approached they feared a counterattack on their flank, and so withdrew, this also moving those inside to follow suit before they could strike a blow. Consulting locals on the best route of attack, the Gallic leaders settled on a massed assault from the direction of Monrea in the northwest. In this area, the camp under Reginus and Robilius was particularly vulnerable, having been placed on sloping ground. Vercingetorix led 60,000 of his best men to a position behind the high ground, the better to conceal themselves for the big attack. Separate smaller assaults were also planned, and it was expected Vercingetorix would add to this pressure once the action began. At noon, masses of angry Gauls closed in on the camp. 2 legions guarded the general area, and since other attacks had also materialized, Caesar could only observe initially and reinforce where the fighting was fiercest. Luckily for the defenders, Caesar's greatest lieutenant and future foe, Titus Labienus, was on hand. Vercassivellaunus had made progress, but Labienus managed to stabilize the situation with reinforcements of 6 cohorts. The fighting was intense, especially around the camp itself, and judging his presence necessary, Caesar himself rode into the frays to encourage the men, shouting this would not merely decide the day, but the entire war. Vercingetorix's own sorties had been ineffective, though his men then instead targeted sections of the contravallation more shielded by the slopes. Somehow the legionaries stood their ground. However, a breakthrough soon materialized, with the starving Gauls scaling the rampart and even desperately hauling down a tower. Caesar urged on Decimus Brutus to stem the tide, but it was not enough. Only with the arrival of the cohorts of Gaius Fabius, and then further troops led by Caesar himself, was disaster finally averted. Then Caesar raced to the site of the greatest struggle. Labienus was too hard-pressed. He sent word he would have to counterattack. Caesar, however, had not come alone. Mustering a final reserve of 4 cohorts, as well as part of the unbloodied cavalry, he moved to aid his most hard-pressed men. With approach of the scarlet cloak of Caesar, a great cheer went up along the line, and this only invigorated both friend and foe alike. Vercassivellaunus had breached the defences. The moment of victory was surely close at hand. Soon he would sup with his cousin and drink a toast to bones of the great Julius Caesar. Alas, no. The Romans, having fought ferociously with their spears, had reverted to their gladii, and from the rear came the other half of Caesar's cavalry. Elation instantly melted into cold terror as the Germanic auxilia sliced their way into their rear. With the stony-faced legionaries to their front and the fierce Germanic foreigners at their backs, the Gauls could do little more than break and flee. Many did not make it far. Indeed, Vercassivellaunus himself was taken, while a general slaughter ensued. News thundered across the field, disheartening the Gauls. With their greatest chance of success now lost, these men too lost their vigor and fled. Accepting that all was now lost, Vercingetorix suggested he be killed or offered up to Caesar. Eventually he dutifully surrendered, dramatically riding out of Alesia in full decorative armor. He rode once around his waiting nemesis, who sat menacingly in his magistrate's chair, then stripped his armor and weapons before waiting to be arrested at Caesar's feet. Although Alesia was not the final battle of the conflict, it effectively ended it. Caesar's own glory was arguably all the greater, given nearly all of Gaul had fought against him. With hostilities calming in Gaul, Caesar was now indisputably the greatest man of the Republic. Yet he knew his enemies back home would never accept that. With the illegal and bloody conquest of Gaul concluded, many questioned if they were next. Was the time of a second Sulla approaching? Only time would tell, as the clouds of war were once again gathering over the Eternal City. If you like what you see, consider supporting my work on Patreon, and you get ad-free early access to my videos for as little as $1. You can also show your support by liking the video, commenting, and subscribing to my channel as a sacrifice to the algorithm. As always, I'll see you in the next one.